Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Lexi from Stop Surrogacy Now, which is an advocacy group that is challenging the British government's proposed surrogacy laws, the widening of what it means to be a surrogate and how that is regulated. And in this conversation, we talk about surrogacy. I learn the different types of surrogacy there are, and we talk about the ethics of surrogacy and what that tells us about our culture, how we view motherhood, how we view children, and how we view the act of procreation and then parental rights, so-called. If you want to learn more or even pitch your hat into the ring and do some support, links to Lexi's work are down there in the description. Without further ado, here is Lexi. Do you do gardening? Do you grow flowers? Is that like a British mom thing?
I don't know if it's a British mom thing. I really like daffodils. So we have daffodils in our garden, and I really like growing vegetables, and I had an allotment for a time, but it's really labor intensive. You need a lot of free time for that sort of thing. So I see it in my future when I retire, but not right now, because I do not have the time right now, that's for sure.
Well, retire from what then? Because there's more than one thing.
Yeah, just life, just work and campaigning and everything. Just, I guess, when some of this stuff is put back in its box or we've moved on from it in some way. Yeah. I do look forward to, because I actually work part-time, so I should, in theory, have lots of time on my hands. But this is what I've been doing on my day off, reading. Can you see this? Can you see how thick that is?
Wow, what are you doing to yourself?
That's that.
Building families through what?
Book. Through surrogacy, a new law.
Oh, okay.
Full report. So that's the 617-page report. And then there's a summary report and other things.
When was that published?
So that was at the end of March. So now for about 3 weeks. Yeah. So I haven't finished it yet. You might be surprised to learn it's taken me more than 3 weeks to read all of that.
And what is the substance of this, should it become law?
Well, depends on where you are on surrogacy, really. I mean, so the premise of the process of law reform was that the government supports surrogacy as a way of having a family. I have to just kind of like make a couple of comparisons here to be sort of like current law and what the proposals are. So at the moment, the commissioning parents wouldn't be able to apply for a parental order until after 6 weeks from the birth. So child is born, child is 6 weeks old, and it's at that point that they can actually make an application for a parental order, which would give them the parental legal rights and legal parenthood, and it would the parental order transfers the parental rights from the mother to the commissioning parents, and they have to apply for that within 6 months. So they can't apply for it until 6 weeks have passed, and they have to apply for it within 6 months. That's the current model. In the proposals, so the draft bill would basically stop that entirely, and at birth, if you meet various conditions and sort of like eligibility, you would have parental rights and be the legal parents at birth. So that would follow the model that's in the Ukraine, the model that's in parts of the US, and the mother would not have legal rights. And if she wanted to change her mind, she can change her mind during pregnancy, but at birth she can't.
Okay.
And she would then have to take legal action, essentially. She would have to apply for a parental order herself for the child that she's given birth to. And she has to do that within 6 weeks of the birth. So it's sort of the 6 weeks. You can't do it until 6 weeks. Well, why not? And then she has to apply for it within the 6 week period. So there's kind of arbitrary time periods and things that are significantly changing with these proposals in terms of parental rights at birth. Yeah.
Are you able to give us a overview of the history of surrogacy, like when it started?
Sure, a bit.
I'm sure there's modern incarnations and then pre-technical incarnations.
Yeah. So in the US, you have a really interesting case, Mary Beth Whitehead, and that's, films have been made about that, kind of like TV films. That's the US case. And then in the UK, we have a lady called Kim Cotton. So ultimately what she did was that she had a baby for strangers, and this was done through a US agency. And she gave the baby up. She knows the baby, she had a baby girl. She doesn't know the name or the name of the commissioning parents. And she has spoken about surrogacy regret and not having contact and things like that, and that being sort of disruptive and negative. And so two things happened. We had a law that was put in place in 1985. That's the law that would be reformed by this bill. And she went on to build something called COTS, which is childlessness overcome through surrogacy. She went on to have, I think, 2 other surrogate-born children, but those were friendships. So the model of UK surrogacy and the model that's been sort of perpetuated and talked about in the narrative and saying it's different from the commercial model is that we have this altruistic model. So it's friendships, families, trust, all of these things are in place, and that's meant to be the model that we follow. But I'm not convinced that that's the case for all surrogacy in the UK, as has been apparent with various different media stories in the past 5 years or so, I'd say. I mean, certainly I've been doing this for 4. So yeah, it's kind of interesting, like the whole media narrative around UK surrogacy and how it's different. And what I have seen change with that is Ukraine. So basically from COVID and obviously since the Russian invasion, we've heard more stories about surrogacy and what the negative sides. And there's been connections with commissioning parents in Ireland and the UK to Ukrainian surrogate mothers. So there's been some sort of interesting stories where it sort of shows a different side to it. And I would say that it's not exactly the same, but there's definitely negative aspects and risk of exploitation, commodification of women's bodies, and of children kind of being the end product. And that's why, certainly pro-surrogacy lobbyists would be wanting to distance themselves from what that is. They kind of refer to surrogacy in the UK being safe and ethical, safe surrogacy, ethical surrogacy. So you have to then sort of think about why that's different or why that's the same.
Well, okay, so let's get a little into the weeds here. What counts as a surrogacy? If a man impregnates a woman other than his wife, is that surrogacy? If he pays for this mistress and it's a child out of wedlock, you just define it as that. There's no title or inheritance that goes down to the child. The child just kind of moves into the house. So that could be one form of it, if you can define it like that. But if the woman impregnates the other woman, if the wife impregnates the other woman with her own egg, that would be surrogacy.
Well, okay. So let's go back a bit. So we've got gestational surrogacy and traditional surrogacy. Okay. So traditional surrogacy is basically where you use your own egg. And that is done obviously through home DIY artificial insemination in a really easy way. So a woman wouldn't have to have the IVF drugs. She would probably monitor her cycle, but she wouldn't have to manipulate her cycle to receive an embryo. She wouldn't have to take any medication. It would be sort of like more of a natural process in a sense. Gestational surrogacy is where the egg comes from somebody else. So that could be the commissioning mother, or that could be a woman who donates her egg. So obviously if there's 2 men, they would need an egg from someone, whether that's the surrogate mother or a woman who donates her egg, or if the commissioning mother, her eggs, she couldn't use them for whatever reason, they would potentially get an egg donor, an egg donated from a woman as well. So then that, obviously be fertilized and grown, and an embryo would be implanted, and then that would be a gestational surrogate pregnancy.
Okay. So just to get the categories correct. So there's one way to do it, the man impregnates the woman, either directly or by means of a turkey baster.
Something like that.
Then, so that's what you're calling traditional surrogacy, where the woman is somehow the mother, the physical mother, is not the legal mother. The child is then adopted into the marriage somehow, or becomes a part of the original marriage.
That whole legal process would take place after the birth under the current law here. But yeah, basically there would be a genetic relationship and a biological relationship between the surrogate mother, the birth mother, the biological mother, and the baby. Whereas when the pregnancy is conceived using an egg from somebody else, there isn't a genetic relationship. And some people say there's not a biological relationship, but I say that there is, because obviously she's still pregnant, and that's a biological process.
Okay, so that would be the other. The other category is that there's a man and a wife, or two women, and the woman in that marriage takes either receives sperm from someone out of the marriage, or receives an egg from somebody out of the marriage. Right. So there's the egg donor.
Yeah.
Is that included in surrogacy?
Yeah, so I mean, the marriage part of it isn't really an essential part of any of this. Obviously, it's relevant when you're talking about commissioning couples or the surrogate mother with a spouse. You know, there's things in the proposals about the spouse and whether they have rights, or their rights are basically not going to be there. So, you know, the woman is autonomous and she can decide to do this independently of what her husband says. So I don't think we need to fixate on the sort of like marriage part of it, but ultimately, if you're in a relationship, whether the surrogate mother is in a relationship or not, she could undertake a gestational surrogacy pregnancy or a traditional surrogacy pregnancy. And the difference would be whether she's genetically related to their child or she isn't. She's always biologically related to that child because she's pregnant. She's the one who's pregnant. Okay. And then the other people, you know, whether they are two men that are married, two women who are married, whether there's two men that aren't married, or, you know, there's a heterosexual relationship, there's a man and a woman, they don't necessarily have to be married. You know, that's not...
Well, okay, so I guess, so absent marriage, it's about who owns the child then.
Yeah. So there's ultimately nearly always three people involved. It doesn't have to be three. You can have a single man, have a surrogate mother give birth to a baby for him. Obviously, that could be a single woman, although it's far less likely because she's a woman herself. She would have to have fertility issues. There'd be other things to do with that. But yeah, basically there's normally three adults joining together to decide this is what they're going to do. Only one of them is pregnant.
Yeah.
So only one of them bears the risk.
Okay, so one aspect of surrogacy then in gestational surrogacy, or one difference, there's two kind of different categories within gestational pregnancies, whether the woman gets an egg from another woman or gives her egg to another woman.
Yeah, there could be two women involved in a gestate. There would be three women potentially involved. So there could be the commissioning mother, an egg donor, and the surrogate mother.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Or there could be the commissioning mother gives her egg, and the surrogate mother obviously carries and bears the pregnancy.
Yeah. And what I'm asking is the egg donor part of this surrogacy conversation?
Okay. All right. So that's an interesting question. So basically, at the moment, yes, she is. So with donor-conceived pregnancies in the UK, there is a register for where the gametes have come from. So obviously, if it's a sperm donor or an egg donor, whoever that person is, that has to be registered. I think since is it 2003 or 2005, I think. So basically, we used to have anonymity, and we still do to a point. Basically, and at 18 years old, the child can find out where their genetics come from. You know, obviously that could be a mixture of things. They could be raised by somebody who they share half their genetics with, and then they could be an anonymous person who they can find out more about when they turn 18. And in an ideal situation, they obviously know about that very early on, and they can find out the information at some point later in their lives. they can also obviously go online and do a DNA test. So, there's the sort of official route, and then they can be independent of that themselves. They can just do internet searches and do a test themselves.
Yeah.
And sorry, I've forgotten your question. I got distracted by the whole donor conception thing.
Trying to, so egg donors or sperm donors, they are part of this conversation and the legalities around where that comes from.
Yeah. So then the egg donor could also be the commissioning mother. So what is proposed under this new law, if it goes through, that there would be a surrogacy register. So similarly to the donor conception register that we have, there would be a surrogacy register where there would be all of the people involved named. And then there would be, I think at 16, you could get non-identifying details. And then at 18, you could get identifying details. So there's proposals within this law, and it would name the commissioning parent or parents, the surrogate mother, and any donor gametes that came from somebody else.
Okay.
So that's not necessarily a bad thing, obviously, for a child to have more information. The reason why all of this is important is because of genealogical bewilderment, which is a term that talks about basically when you have like a disruption or sort of like a mystery, a discombobulation to do with where you've come from and sort of growing up and feeling like, obviously adopted children have this, children who don't know both their genetic parents and sort of like where their roots are. So that is, quite a good thing that the proposals suggest, that there's a register. So it's not just registering the commissioning parents or just the method by which they were sort of, the donor gametes, but also the surrogate mother. So that would record all of that. Okay.
And so on the topic of a woman outsourcing the pregnancy to another woman, what's the story around that and the legislation around that, and where you are pushing or pulling on that?
Well, basically, it's permitted. I mean, it's been permitted since the 1985 Surrogacy Act was put in place, basically as a result of this woman, Kim Cotton, that I talked about. So there were various reviews. There was something called the Warnock Review, and it was to do with expenses so that we didn't have, a commercial system. But it's always been permitted in the UK since the mid-80s.
Okay. So if a woman is outsourcing pregnancy to another woman, that other woman is doing, labor for the primary woman.
Yeah.
How that labor is taken care of, altruistically would assume that the other woman, the gestational mother, would just do it for free. Which is a lot of work, which doesn't make sense, because that woman has to eat a lot more, and there's
so that's
wear and tear on her body, right?
Yeah. So that's where it kind of gets a little bit messy, because, I mean, for example, I've worked in companies where if I have driven my car for work, I can claim petrol money, and I can claim a very small percentage for wear and tear because I've driven 500 miles or whatever it might be. It doesn't work like that. But there are costs related to pregnancy which are permitted currently, and they would be permitted in the new law. So they've sort of given it a little bit of a rebrand in terms of what it's called. So it's not called expenses anymore. It's called permitted costs and mandatory costs. So your mandatory costs are things like life and critical illness cover. I was reading it again today, and I was interested to see that wills weren't included in that, in the proposed law under the mandatory costs. But then permitted costs are, it says that they're costs related to the pregnancy. So currently under the current system, you have expenses and you can claim, for example, parking at the hospital when you have a scan appointment, or folic acid, or maternity clothes. But in addition to that, now you can claim for a portion of your grocery bill. You can claim for some of your sort of like utilities at home. So if you have a hot bath, there are things where I've seen women include things like having a gardener. So, she's not able to do the gardening because she's pregnant. She can have a gardener included. And that isn't a cost of pregnancy. I mean, for example, when, if you have women who are pregnant, they might do the gardening themselves. I mean, we don't get that provided for us. That's not a cost of pregnancy, and you can get the NHS to pay for whatever, or you get it on your private medical healthcare, that kind of thing. So is it a cost of pregnancy, or is it like life expect? Like, is it a cost of living? If your rent and your mortgage is included, that's because you need a roof over your head. That's not because you're pregnant.
Yeah. Well,
and then
unless you can't work because you're pregnant.
Well, yes, but I mean, you can work whilst you're pregnant. You may not want to, and there might be medical reasons and health risks connected to why maybe in late stages of pregnancy maybe you shouldn't. Plenty of women have had to have bed rest because of the risk to losing the pregnancy. Yeah. But in the UK, we have pretty good employee benefits. So you can't lose your job if you're sick. You can't lose your job if you're pregnant, or, if you did, you could take like an employment tribunal. It would be difficult, but you would have good reason if that's why you were essentially fired or managed out of your job, things like that.
Okay. So this is just, it's incredible because this process reveals the invasion of technocracy or bureaucracy into human life. The itemization of a human life. It just kind of dystopian or fascinating, depending on how you look at it.
Well, I think both. Yeah. I mean, part of the consultation, I remember when I read this, it really kind of struck me. But there was a question about what a woman should be paid in terms of sort of expenses, which now has this sort of rebrand in terms of language. If she lost the pregnancy, at what stage she lost the pregnancy, how much there should be in terms of expenses. So, and what should happen, because it was sort of, there's always this recognition of it being a contract that isn't enforceable. Like, we don't have contracts for surrogacy here in the UK. That's that's very common in the States. It's a commercial arrangement, right? But it really brought it home to me. Like, if you ultimately, the pregnancy is the service, the labor is the delivery. And we also call that, the delivery, that you deliver a baby. And then the baby is sort of like the end product. And the baby being the end product, that's what everybody wants. That's what the whole process is for. And yet it's the least considered person in this arrangement, because the three adults that I talked about, it's usually three adults, their desires and what they want is the priority, and they make the plan and they make the decisions and they take the action, and then the child at the center of it is oddly not considered, but is still at the center. It's quite strange.
Well, I think that's because the child, to center the child, is to bring a lot of questions into this, a lot of moral questions. And it seems like this whole process is set up to avoid the moral aspect or the ethical aspects of it.
Exactly. Right? Yeah.
So it's like this the baby's there, but we're just talking about the stork. All we're talking about, we're not talking about the baby. We're just talking about the stork, right? Because if we talk about the baby, then there's all these other things, and then blah, 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 blah. We don't need to do that. The baby will find out later when they're 16 or 18. But right now we're just talking about the stork. Right. Yeah.
There's a thing where I think so I think about it in two observations that I make of that, is that we consider children blank canvases, and that's almost in that way where, kind of in wildlife, I don't know, like with wolves or other animals, like you can, the first kind of adult they see is they imprint on them, and they see that as their mother. So we think, okay, well, the baby comes out of the mother and goes to these other people or this other person, and that's okay because it's the same. And it sort of completely erases the connection that the woman has had and the baby has had with the mother. And then it also doesn't really think about the child when it grows up. So obviously they think about the baby and, the labor, and then getting the baby and having the baby and taking the baby home and having that sort of newborn phase. And there's sort of a real lack of consciousness around that being sort of a human that will grow up and have there's like a possible impact to that. And maybe there isn't, but the thing is we can't study it because we can't take children away from their mothers at birth and just as an experiment, just to sort of see what happens if we...
Well, that's what's happening.
Yeah, this is...
So just get the data, right?
Ultimately it's like a social experiment. I mean, there is a study that's of surrogate born children that I'm waiting to see if it comes out. I think the first part of the report is out. And there are studies about surrogate born children, but they're very young. The children are quite young. They haven't, reached an age where they would be considering having their own family. So I think it's sort of a really long-term thing. Like, you don't really... I mean, for example, if you are a surrogate born child and you're a girl, and then you grow up and then you maybe cannot have your own children for infertility reasons or whatever it might be, and then you want to have a surrogate mother yourself, I think there'd be some real questions about that. And then also, if you're pregnant yourself, you're thinking, well, I've got this baby and it's inside my body and I carry it around all day and I'm bonding with it. And I didn't have that. My mother came from another place. And I think basically you can't ask 14-year-olds. I think they're a bit older now. I think they might be 16. We can't ask questions of them at that age about this experience and them growing up in this way, because they haven't reached an age where they would be considering building families themselves. And I think it changes. I mean, it changes with the whole genealogical bewilderment thing, and it changes with adoption. So if you're adopted, you grow up, you can be in a very happy family, really great parents. And some people basically wait for their adoptive parents to pass away before they go looking for their birth mother. Yeah. Or they know that if they look for their birth mother, it's really going to affect their parents. There's a lot in there. Yeah.
There's a lot in there, and it's very difficult to study. But so you're talking about the existential aspects of having a severance between you and your lineage, which is more or less psychological. But one wonders about rates of depression, rates increased or decreased health outcomes. And insofar as the NHS, which is your national healthcare system,
health service, yeah.
Insofar as the NHS is involved in surrogacy, it should be mandated, no matter what the NHS is doing, it should be taking data on everything. It should have complete and just completely recording data on everything, and should be compiling reports constantly about everything that it's involved in. One would think, especially if we're looking at the gender topic or the transition topic, the child transition topic, insofar as the NHS is doing this, it should be absolutely mandatory that it documents and, privatizes or anonymizes the data, but just document it. And the same should be there with surrogacy.
Yeah. So you mean in terms of like if you have a woman come in and deliver a baby and it's recorded as a surrogacy pregnancy and it's recorded as a surrogacy delivery, and then and obviously the study going forward of those people involved.
Yeah, one would just assume that baby would be tagged throughout its life, and all that information would be compiled.
Not at all. I mean, we have something in the UK called Embrace, which is a really good thing that we have that it should basically be mandatory for in other countries as well. I know that you don't have it in the States, but it monitors maternal death. So it looks at reasons as to why women die during pregnancy, labour, and then I think there's a period of about a year afterwards. And it's not, surrogacy isn't specifically monitored. And there's been studies where surrogate pregnancies, so I think it was the Centre of Bioethics, or was it? So it's Jennifer Lal, one of your previous guests, who did a study recently about increased risks in surrogacy pregnancies, and in there was postnatal depression as well. So there are studies that sort of exist around surrogacy, but we don't record it as a mandatory sort of field for pregnancy. So, you know, you could go in, it would be monitored on the ground with midwives, and, you know, obviously they prioritize the pregnant woman and you know, her health during the pregnancy and obviously during her labor. But I mean, that's a real concern if we have increased surrogacy in the UK, because basically it's the midwives and the maternity wards that are going to have to work out what to do. You know, what if she changes her mind? And, you know, we have this legal process, but I mean, what if she... So there's a whole thing in here about consent, which I can go into, but ultimately she can withdraw a woman can withdraw her consent under this proposal up until the birth. And she can record this by, you know, a voice note or a text message, and she has to inform the commissioning parents and the RSO, which is basically a surrogacy agency, that she has to do this process. You have to go through them. But I was thinking of this the other day, and I was thinking, well, what if you're sort of mid-labor and you change your mind, or maybe even, you know, the head's out, you know, it's like at birth, literally it says at birth, the commissioning parents are the parents. Yeah. So if she's in labor and she's about to deliver the baby, does that mean she's still pregnant and she can still withdraw her consent? Or
if the baby's in her arms and the umbilical cord hasn't been cut and the placenta's still inside of her,
exactly.
Is she still joined with the child?
Yes. I mean, yes, exactly. You know, so
who decides that?
Yeah. And
this is the baby. We're not talking about the stork now.
Yeah. So it's kind of strange. And then basically she has this period of 6 weeks afterwards where she can, so the commissioning parents are already the legal parents, but she can basically then apply for a parental order. So she's not a legal parent, but she can apply for that. But what if it's 6 weeks on one day? What if it's 7 weeks? You know, there's that cutoff period. And I think of that 6 week period when, you know, if you're recovering from a C-section, you know, your hormones are all over the place. You can make the application, but you would need sort of like legal representation and be able to pursue
this is really dicey.
It's a legal action. Yeah.
You're on the verge of calling women irrational, where they can't make rationally informed decisions when their physical body is intruding on them with hormones. I mean, this is where we get down to.
Yeah. I mean, that's historically what we've heard. You know, you're hysterical.
Too.
Yeah, you're hysterical. You know,
I'm just saying, once we intrude upon the mother-child with our rational process, eventually we're going to find the numinous. Eventually we're going to find the ambiguity. Yeah. Eventually the knife is going to sever something that is profoundly real.
I mean, reading this, I'm not sure that is evident in the law. I think there's parts of it where I think they're sort of trying to make it better or trying to recognize the mother a bit more. But then, you know, there's things where it's, you know, they say, you know, you can't have a permitted cost. So in the expenses that we have now, you can have a holiday, and now under permitted costs, you know, in the detail of the report, it says you can have a holiday afterwards and a recuperative holiday. And it's like, well, that's just what they can have now. So it's not really that different. You know, you can still have a parental order if you have a child. So if you are commissioning parents in the UK, you can still go to another country and get a baby from another country and bring the child back here to the UK and get a parental order. You know, this was part of the reason what they said they wanted to sort of shut down, because it was exploiting women overseas. So we're kind of making it easier to exploit women in the UK. And we're recognizing their autonomy, and we're saying this is all right because they don't mind, and this is what they want. And then we recognize that there's risk of exploitation. This report, it recognizes that there's risk of exploitation, but it doesn't stop it from happening. It doesn't say,
Okay,
well, we're going to ban that or we're going to
let's
restrict
define
that.
this risk of exploitation. I mean, what does that really mean? What is that appealing to? Some sort of human, some sort of sense of the human, right? We don't exploit other human beings, but the child is being completely exploited through the entire thing. So we have to completely double logic or ignore the child because the child's the one being exploited. And so the woman has to be exploited too, or the justification for whatever this exploitation is. So what is that exploitation? How do they define exploitation?
So far, I don't see a definition of it in what I've read. And I haven't read the whole thing because it's a phone book. But what I believe they're talking about when they say this is that they're referring to it as international surrogacy, and that there's a risk of exploitation because it's cheaper and you can pay a much reduced price for surrogacy, and they don't want people to go abroad to exploit women, pay much less and get a baby and then get parental rights at birth. We're saying let's allow that here, and we'll control it and we'll measure it and monitor it, so-called monitor it, all through these surrogacy agencies.
It's not being monitored.
Going to be renamed. Yeah, I mean, the surrogacy register isn't a bad idea, but, there's I don't think it removes the risk. I think it relocates it.
Yeah. Well, I think it's already been relocated. I think the exploitation is already happening, just by our conception of the child, our conception of pregnancy, and our conception of womanhood and fatherhood and parenthood, and what it means to have a child and what it means to have parents have already that has already been destabilized prior to this happening. So I think that you can't stop people from doing this. You can make it more difficult.
Other countries have. Yeah, you can make it more difficult. And there are countries that ban it entirely. It doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't go on. But ultimately, if you leave the country and you come back with a child that isn't one that you've given birth to, so you haven't gone and given birth on holiday and somehow had to get like a temporary travel document to prove the birth and prove that you've got a relationship, and you're leaving the country with a baby that you weren't pregnant with when you left, and you come back, there's going to be barriers to you leaving the airport, and there's going to be people sort of checking and thinking, well, where did this kid come from? And there was a case in France a few years back now where a couple got a baby, I think it was from India, from a woman in India. And this is before they banned it in India, because it was actually, international surrogacy was banned. Surrogacy in families is still permitted in 2019. And they brought this baby back, and basically a judge refused to recognize their parental rights. And so I think they took it to the European Court of Human Rights, and I think they won. But I think there was a fine.
What would happen to the baby? I guess
the baby ultimately stays in the care of these two people. It's not like the child is taken away. They had to get they had to track down and find the Indian surrogate mother, and I don't know whether she flew to France or what happened exactly, but it had to be written up somehow that she gave her permission and that was checked. But surrogacy was banned in France, I think, and it still is banned in France.
Okay.
So this judge basically took a particular position, and other judges would say, no, it's fine, we'll grant you access and we'll call this child your legal child and you the legal parents. But in countries where it's banned,
well, what is being banned?
It's not allowed. We ban all kinds of things and apply the law. Then there's other things that we ban that we don't apply the law to. We just kind of let people carry on with it, even though it's illegal.
Well, what's actually being banned? So we go back to the definition of what surrogacy is. So either a man impregnates a woman, or a woman impregnates a woman, or or something. A woman donates. So you can. What's being banned is, I guess, the only thing that you could really try to crack down on or ban would be the technology, which would have to do with the eggs, where the eggs come from, and the trading of the eggs, and then the gestational period. But if a man goes to another country and, with the permission of his wife, impregnates another woman, then I don't see how you could ban that, and then it would be
illegal.
It would only be a matter of
legal process.
who the nationality of the child, right? The legal rights of that child is what's in question.
So you would have the issue of the birth certificate. You would have the issue of registering that child at school, registering that child for medical care. Obviously, if you were putting somebody on your private healthcare in the US, for example, if it was banned, which is, it's pretty much everywhere. I think there's a couple of states that restrict it or ban it. But ultimately, there's the international. So we were talking about gestational surrogacy and traditional surrogacy. You also obviously have domestic surrogacy and international surrogacy. So someone can go abroad, come back with a baby. You're going to have you're going to have some, important documents to sign. There's a process. Some people do it without understanding what is required of them, and that's difficult and complicated. And then domestic surrogacy, which the Law Commission, who reviewed all of this and have made the recommendations, they want to encourage that. They want domestic surrogacy to be the more accessible option and the more likely decision that people take, so they don't go abroad.
Because that is decreases the likelihood of this so-called exploitation, and also makes it cleaner for the state to deal with this new entity. Absolutely, yeah. And so we have the NHSA, like we've said, we have the birth certificate process. All of that would be accessible and easier if it all happens here on UK soil, sort of thing. But then, in countries where you have it banned as a blanket ban, and you cannot have surrogacy from a domestic point of view or from an international point of view, that is really monitored through the birth certificate. So obviously, if you have a domestic, somebody goes to register the birth, the birth is recorded in the hospital, and you know who the mother is, and then you go and register the birth. So, for example, in the UK, a man cannot go and register the birth of a child on his own. He can only go if he's married. So if he's married, he can then take his marriage certificate to say, look, I'm married to this woman. She's my wife. She gave birth, and this is our child. And I can now register the birth of this child with the name and the details. And that goes on birth desks and the registry we have in the UK that records all of this, that, feeds into all kinds of data that we have. All kinds of stuff about the census and our birth rates, and things like embrace, and sort of like knowing which women are affected by if they have maternal death. They have the details. So you would have the legal aspects of it that would really be the way to monitor it, I think. So there's a legal, well, see, this is the thing. So I'm trying to get to the ethical or the existential or the philosophical grounding to, are you for or against surrogacy? And so pro-surrogacy would probably take a consent model that human beings are free to do what human beings are going to do. Yeah. And we're going to try to regulate this to minimize harm. That's what the state's going to do. And if it goes all the way to a ban on that, then the only thing that I could see in the UK banning would be some sort of artificial insemination. And then that goes into the laws around artificial insemination, or artificial, not insemination, artificial ovulation, maybe? Is that the right term?
We do have the HFEA that already, so that's the Human Fertilization Embryology Authority in the UK, which already does an assessment of clinics and already sort of like monitors and makes they have assessments and they have licenses. So we have a regulatory model for that already. So we're not talking about banning people from accessing IVF or banning people from accessing donor-conceived gametes. We are sort of for a ban, but we are for a ban because we think about the child and the mother. So we think about it in a social sense and a moral sense. And it's not... this isn't necessarily directly recognised in the proposed law or necessarily in the current one, but people who are pro-surrogacy would say, I think, that surrogacy is a really lovely way to build a family. Like you say, it's body autonomy, it's consent. Everybody agrees to it, and there's no harm done because the child grows up in a loving family and it's all fine. that bit we sort of know a bit about. And I think there are some surrogacy arrangements that have worked out well for people. I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's all awful. But when you think about the concept of it and where we are in society and what we accept, what we say is socially acceptable, if we're saying that surrogacy is okay, we are saying that it's okay for a child to be taken from its mother at birth and for that woman to use her body in that way, and the consequences, whatever they might be, because everybody's consented and it's all consensual, it almost like doesn't matter what happens after that because everybody's on board. So I have a real great interest in why women become surrogate mothers. There's a blog piece that we did that was it was about a BBC series. It was a short series. It's called The Surrogates, and it's still on BBC iPlayer, I think. But the women who were the surrogate mothers who were sort of interviewed and followed, and their journeys were documented. There was a woman who was a single mother. She was in her mid-20s, and she talked about how surrogacy basically healed suicidal thoughts. She was really young, and she was living in a sort of single bedroom. It was like a one-room apartment. She was on benefits. She wasn't working. She actually seemed quite lonely, and I think part of it was a way of extending her family in a way. She had her son and she had her mother, but the dad of the son wasn't in the picture, and that was sort of she had a child for two men, and so maybe there was a bit of a motivation there to sort of expand her family in that way. And we have heard from women who have surrogacy regret, and there's one story in particular that reminds me of that too, and I can't share many details, but ultimately I think she did it because she was lonely as well. Another story in that documentary was about a woman who she was kind of like an exotic dancer and party girl, but she got pregnant when she was quite young and lost her friends because she went into the family and sort of into a different lifestyle. And she talks about it in very material terms. She talks about it as, when she meets the people who she's having a baby for, she says, what can they give me? I know what I can give them, but what can they give me? And I was watching that, and we've, like I say, written a blog about it. And I just think there's lots of reasons why women do that we don't really explore, and we don't really ask why. And from the women that we've heard from, there's something that I think could be called toxic femininity, about wanting to help, or thinking that you should help, or thinking that you can be useful. When we hear about surrogacy in the media, it's about, they used a surrogate. We don't hear the word mother. Sometimes they just say, the baby was born through surrogacy, like a sort of like this mysterious woman did, like the stork, basically. Yeah. We're back to the stork again.
Yeah, and humanizing the stork. So I'm two potential paths to cement an ethical argument against surrogacy, or at least towards a restriction or heavy regulation of surrogacy, would hinge on outcomes for the child and outcomes for the women. The motivations for the women is more of a think piece to stir up public either condemnation or acceptance of this, mm-hmm. which is beyond the law, like changing public opinion or bringing light. Bringing public attention to this, and then framing it through, why are the women doing this? Why are the parents doing this? What does it say about our culture? What does it say about our relationship to human life, and which are very profound cultural questions that can't be really enforced. They can only be kind of society kind of goes and says, this is our value. And we're in a really difficult time right now, I think in part because of our technocratic and liberal understanding of the autonomous individual that is based on everything is contractual, nothing's obligation, and kind of reversing how we conceive of the human being would be kind of searching to pre-liberal roots, which is a really big project and kind of fraught. And then you have very big moral questions about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness happiness, ultimately. So that would have to be built around narratives, and the narrative would be about the women and then the couples who are engaging in this behavior. And then also, what I think is a very important, necessary part of this is collecting data, health data, outcome data, psychological data on the child themselves as they become a human being. And then making an argument 20 years down the road of, okay, so we have a bunch of data now, and this is like the likelihood of different, problems with the pregnancy or problems with the child later on down the road, and and trying to screen that from other incidental things, like the kid was going to be depressed no matter what because they were just a depressive kid. But did surrogacy incline them more towards feelings of alienation or something like that? So it's a big project what you're going up against. So in the short term, what is your advocacy aimed at doing or accomplishing it?
So obviously with this draft bill, we're interested in talking to parliamentarians so that we can have an opportunity to share our point of view on it. So like I said, the Nordic model now did the templates. That was for the public consultation, and what happened before that was that there was obviously a lobbying process to get surrogacy onto the programme for reform in the first place. And, they didn't meet with any women's groups. They only met with us afterwards, after the public consultation was closed. They met with
by they, you're talking about the MPs
the Law
at the Parliament?
Sorry, the Law Commission. So the Law Commission is kind of like an independent government body. It looks at reviewing law. That's literally its job. And then it does, all the research and puts it all together and then delivers it to government to say, so this is under the Department of Health and Social Care, who agreed that this should be looked at and for it to be taken forward. We have also something called all-party parliamentary groups, and they are sort of an area or an issue that's being looked at. And we have one for surrogacy. It's very pro-surrogacy, and they are basically briefing MPs and talking to MPs about what this is. So obviously sort of perhaps not sharing the alternative view that I might share or present. So, we're looking for an opportunity to have a seat at the table, essentially, and have our views shared. And
process aside, what is your position, and then what is the argument that you are intending to make?
Well, ultimately, we at this time would like the proceedings to be paused and for us not to be pursuing reform of this of the Surrogacy Act, of the 1985 Surrogacy Act at this time. So that very much depends on what the government decides to do with it. But we would want to have, well, there's a few things really, but ultimately we would like to have a bit more time to look at it and think about it from a different perspective, because ultimately the number of responses that they received, if it's the majority of responses didn't want surrogacy in the first place, they want it banned. This is a public consultation, anybody can respond. They've obviously had it informed from people involved in surrogacy, but as a social issue, the laws of this land affect everybody, so we all get a chance to put in our 2 pennies worth.
Yeah, but process aside, what is your position and what is your argument? Like, okay, so you want to pause it, but why?
We would like to see...
Why is surrogacy wrong, bad, or just not good?
I think because of what we've discussed, because of the exploitation of women and the commodification of their bodies, and the inability to recognise the child in this, and the importance of the child as a human being who I mean, I always think about if a newborn baby could speak, which obviously they can't. They only know their mother when they're born. We as humans only know our mothers. It's the only thing that we know. They're our home, and when we are on the outside of their bodies, the things that comfort us are hearing her heartbeat, smelling her smell, hearing her voice. That does change over time, obviously, but very much in the fourth trimester, the first 3 months of our lives. I wouldn't be advocating for a Handmaid's Tale situation where, the woman lives with the commissioning parents and breastfeeds the baby. And
well, this is just Handmaid's Tale through the market.
Yeah, and it's kind of like in this regulated way, and we're saying, well, you know, she's autonomous and everything else. But that comes to my mind when I think about what I want. I don't want I want babies to be with their mothers unless there are really, really good reasons as to why they shouldn't, and that would center the child. I don't think surrogacy centers the child.
But I mean, so the counter to that would be how does arguing against surrogacy not also dovetail with arguing against abortion and arguing against adoption? Isn't it all a piece? If you want,
No,
if the
not
foundation
to me, no.
argument is that you want babies to be with their mothers, then
But only in
what's the line
where
on
cases
that?
are adoption absolutely centers the child. So in
Okay.
in the UK, we don't have private adoption. We have a system where there will be concerns about the child's well-being and safety staying with the mother for whatever reason that might be. A child is only removed from the mother in very extreme circumstances. Social workers and health care and the social sort of, we have a system, we have community nurses in the UK. You know, there'll be a monitoring process, but also for the most part, there will be trying to keep babies with their mothers unless there are really good reasons not to.
So a mom can't opt out of motherhood without, she can't just say.
She can. Yeah, she can. I mean, obviously she could place her child in foster care, but people would ask why. They would say, why do you want to do that? And there would be cooling off periods and meetings and things that were assessed as to whether that was the right thing for her, the right thing for the baby. Obviously, if the woman is a drug addict, or she's living with an abusive partner, or there's neglect issues, or there's abuse. I mean, we have lots of cases in the UK, increasingly it seems, of child neglect and abuse. The social care system is under a lot of strain, but I mean, the principles are the child is centered in adoption, and they are removed for the purposes of having a better life, or a safer circumstances, or whatever that might be. I don't see the only comparison I see between surrogacy and adoption is the genealogical bewilderment element, where, you know, children don't know where they come from and how that affects them. Legally in this country, they're quite different, and increasingly so. I would like to see more of the draft law be more like adoption, and for there to be tighter regulations, because we have very tight regulations for adoption. People who apply to adopt a child, I mean, it's years in the process. You certainly, you know, would be quite it would be quite unusual to get a baby. You would normally get an older child.
Oh, really?
And
okay.
that would be because that child is not in a good place and needs to be somewhere else. Absolutely.
Okay.
So I guess that might differ quite a lot from the States.
So there's just this magical moment, and this is another like a rational liberal point of view where we start to, there's a fuzzy line. So at some point the child becomes centered, but not on even I'm sure abortion's regulated. And there's got to be some sort of ethical questions around abortion, unless in your country it's just free flow whenever.
No,
not post-birth abortion. You guys aren't there?
How do you have post-birth abortion? Pretty essential that there's still a pregnancy for there to be an abortion. So abortion is really different, because in abortion, a child is not born. That's the whole sort of purpose. You know, it's about the woman, her body autonomy. She doesn't want to be a mother for whatever reason. We have restrictions in the UK.
So what? I'm sure that restriction is basically chronological.
Yeah, timeline. So I think it's 26 weeks. Is it 24 weeks or 26 weeks? You'd have to look it up. But basically, it's any late term terminations of pregnancy, so basically an abortion, but you know, they're very specific circumstances. It's usually around health reasons for the woman. There was a woman in Ireland, I remember, who essentially died. So the pregnancy was no longer viable. So basically the baby it was basically a stillborn, but labour had not, couldn't be induced, and because of the legal aspects around abortion in Ireland, and I think she either got septicemia or she got an infection or something, and she died. So we have interventions, and we have really tightly regulated. So 2 doctors have to sign off on an abortion in the UK. We have access to early home abortions with pills. And you can access those through abortion clinics. We have BPAS, Mary Stopes, and Mary Stopes operate internationally as well. So, we have
what's that word?
Mary Stopes International. Mary Stopes is so there's a history with this woman in particular, and you could look her up. I think was some stuff around eugenics, but ultimately it was taken over by 2 men. I remember one of them was called Tim Black, and he was a obstetrician, and they sort of changed what it was about and expanded so that there's
Is this an abortion clinic?
Care. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So an abortion provider, yeah. So they operate clinics around the world, including in the UK. So there's a UK side and an international side. It's very different from surrogacy.
Can women do international late-term abortion? I guess you can't really stop them, right?
I
wonder if that's even a thing.
So a woman coming here for a late-term abortion, you mean?
Or a woman fleeing the country to go have that procedure done somewhere else?
Quite possibly.
Yeah, just like this whole, like a can of worms, like when we're talking reproductive law, reproductive health care. Surrogacy is showing the conflict in where the child becomes viable as centered, and how that's treated through surrogacy, through artificial insemination, through abortion. So there are laws, and those laws have to be based on some sort of cultural.
There's there's some really interesting stuff happening around IVF, essentially artificial reproductive technology, so ART. So basically anything where pregnancy is
mediated by technology.
Created, so clinics, science. There was a conference here in London quite recently, it might have just been last month, basically looking at new techniques. And there was something in the paper I remember reading about 2 dad mice. We already have genetic engineering, we have CRISPR, the doctor, the scientist who genetically engineered these twin girls who were born in China. He's just recently out of prison because he was fined and his team were fined for breaking international ethics code. So, there's lots of things that are happening. I also find areas of the fertility industry and sort of ART to be really predatory of women. So particularly, young women looking for egg donors, looking for to stock up their egg banks. And we're not far from that with surrogacy if we liberalize it and make it and relax the laws and make it more accessible. So there's something here about advertising in the UK, and currently you can advertise for egg donors. And I have heard about young women going to university and finding in their freshers packs an advert that says, do something amazing, make a family. Yeah. And in the UK, it's not commercial, officially speaking, but you can be paid expenses up to £750 every time you donate, and you can donate 10 times.
Okay. Wow.
So £750 isn't an enormous amount, but it is actually quite, it's not life-changing, but it's still a lot of money if you were struggling. And if you are spun a narrative that says, well, you're not using your egg, you're just having a period every month, you're not using it, somebody else could use it and could have a family as a result. Wouldn't that be incredible? There's lots of glossy adverts, usually very young, attractive women smiling, looking very carefree. And I know that you have that in the States, but we have it here too. And it's perhaps not as extensive, but it's not nothing.
You get your OnlyFans and your Ovum fans in your college packet. Like, here, make money while you're going to college. Get a webcam and here's some drugs and just squat out a little egg. But
there's lots of
the whole donor thing is pretty stressful for the human body. The female body. They have to inject you with a bunch of hormones.
There's a lot of really strong medication. I mean, I think Lupron is one of the medications used for to generate. It's basically the drug to generate ovulation, and so you obviously ovulate. Usually, I mean, not every woman does, but you normally ovulate one a month, right? And it's from different sides, different ovaries. But it's to sort of stimulate the ovaries to shed lots at once, so that you can sort of suck up these mature eggs and freeze them, or fertilize them. And there's a trigger shot to release the eggs. And women in the UK, we've got a blog on our website which is about a woman who did it, and she talks about how she was under anesthetic and actually her body was really struggling with it, and so they kind of brought her out of the anesthetic. And it was a question of whether they sort of put her back under and get the rest of the eggs, because if you don't collect all of the eggs that are there, you have more eggs in there than you should have, because the body doesn't produce more than one a month. So there's lots of really, it's very dehumanizing, and it's very like the commodification again. It's kind of like a woman's body could be useful. So we talk about using surrogates, being useful. You can use your egg in this way. You can give your egg. You can harvest your egg.
And how do you push against that? That's a deeply seated cultural value. We've done that to everything in our lives. So reversing that point of view,
it's going to be really tough, because I think there's a really strong narrative being spun to women, and I think potentially children. So one thing I saw from one of the surrogacy agencies, what they did want this being taught in schools. They did want, I think, the message that we send to children about surrogacy and about ART is really important. So on this, there was another documentary on the BBC actually, and this woman was a surrogate mother for her colleagues, and she sat with her children. She's heavily pregnant, and they're like, "Oh, Mum, you're a surrogate," and that's her son and her daughter seeing that, and it struck me, what message does that send? That she's helping and she's being generous and kind, or is there something in there about how she's using her body in this way to help other people, and that's what women do?
Yeah.
And
that's what a child is. A child is
just
something that a woman produces.
And it's her job.
Like wet nurses or chattel. Like it just chattelizes the female.
And in one of the documentaries that Jennifer Lull produced, there was a surrogate mother who had regret, and she talked about her daughter. So she had a surrogate born daughter and a daughter, and her daughter said, something about why did you give away this baby, and why did you keep me, or will you ever give me away? And I don't know. I mean, one of the things in the draft law, just to go back to that, they talk about implications counselling, and their recommendation is that this is not needed for the children of surrogate mothers or the wider family. It's obviously sort of like just the commissioning parents and the surrogate mother who's involved. And that was quite an interesting kind of observation.
What's this, implications?
Implications counselling. So it's not like therapy. It's basically to assess, to talk about some of the processes around surrogacy, and ultimately, can you give the baby up? And this is before you get pregnant. So
it's like an informed consent, but with an aspect of psychological investigation or preparedness testing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it sort of, again, sounds like a good idea, but it doesn't really look at anything to do with what the motivations of the surrogate mother are. It's not like deeply involved therapy. You might have 1 or 2 sessions, and it would involve the surrogate mother and the commissioning parents, and basically everyone saying, yes, this is fine, we can proceed. And it's a bit of a tick box exercise, if you ask me. if you were having really in-depth counselling about why you were motivated to do this, there could be all kinds of things. And we've heard from women. There's so many examples that I've heard of why women have done this. There can be childhood trauma of varying degrees. It can be because they're now divorced and their husband cheated on them and they want to feel whole. I mean, there was a story about a woman, not that we spoke to this particular woman, and she didn't go through a surrogacy agency, but she met these people on Facebook and she had a stillbirth. And she was sort of, I don't want to put words in her mouth because she's given her own story, but it's sort of replacing a child that she lost, but she couldn't have another child because they sort of couldn't afford to. They had 2 sons. But she
so
went
it's
through
therapeutic. It's a therapeutic.
Yeah, but I mean, she went through baby loss, this enormous loss, and somebody thought that would be a good idea to then use her as a surrogate. I mean, I don't know what goes through the minds of somebody who thought that was a good idea.
Yeah, but there's also just the question of the motivation of people seeking surrogates. Like, what is their motivation to have a child, and to what degree do we regulate or respect the desire for infertile couples, whether they're by means of being homosexual, just naturally infertile in one sense or another. Or then you have the luxury question of, you have these women, these starlets or very powerful women who don't want to ruin their bodies, so they outsource that to other people to do that ruinous labor and provide them the product, the byproduct of that labor.
Take the risk as well, right? They take the risk and they take the burden and they pay them.
Yeah.
To do that. And I mean, we call that, generally speaking, social surrogacy. But then I don't see being a same-sex couple as being, you're not infertile. 2 men just don't have the common ingredients that are required, so you're not infertile. I mean, there are men who've obviously donated their sperm who are whether they're in heterosexual couples or gay couples, and they may or may not go on to have surrogates. I mean, I know of one particularly well-known couple one of the gentlemen has donated his sperm and he's got multiple children, and then he has multiple children who've been born through surrogacy, and he's still married but has a boyfriend, and I think they've had their second surrogate-born child. And they run a surrogacy agency, and they did a casting for the egg donor woman. So, I mean, there's a lot of really commercial aspects to surrogacy in really extreme ways. And, you don't necessarily hear about these stories. If it's in the media in the UK, it's said it's a lovely thing. Everyone consents, and I think when you talk about, why do these people come to it? Why do they want to go through surrogacy? Why do they want to have a family that way? I mean, there's sort of the really obvious reasons. But it's all kind of framed as this really lovely, beautiful thing. And ultimately, I think people really like babies. Like, they like it when people become parents. They like it when people form a family.
Romantic. Yeah.
And it's kind of, that is thinking about family values and, raising children and the next generation. And, I'm not without sympathy for people who are infertile and who haven't been able to do this in like the kind of old-fashioned, really easy way. Anyone who struggled with infertility is going to have sympathy, as I do, and a lot of our volunteers do. I mean, there are women who are unable to have children themselves and are very against surrogacy because they understand the issues with it and what it means. And what it means for another woman. Friends of theirs or a sister or a cousin might have offered themselves, and these women have said no. I mean, sort of, thank you very much for the offer, but are sort of really like, no, I would never ask that of you.
It takes that again is a social value of restraint and humility. Like, I can't and I shouldn't, so I won't. So the argument is about that shouldn't. The can't is the can't, I can't do this thing is the prompt. The should or shouldn't is the argument. And then why would you not? And the value would be, well, I shouldn't and I can't. So you have to kind of accept the restraint of your humanity, but technology upsets that. Technology accesses.
When you come to bioethics, the root of that, and I haven't studied bioethics, but the way that I view it is just because you can doesn't mean you should. So just because we can, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we can do. I mean, there's like
engineer a virus maybe and put it in a wet market somewhere. And
I'm not going there. I'm not going to go there. Okay. But I mean, there's lots of things in terms of ART and medicine and science. And, you know, obviously I'm very pro any sort of development on that, because I think there's just this incredible stuff that we can do. We can save lives. And we know so much that, you know, we wouldn't have an opportunity to know if we didn't have the developed brains that we have and the science that we've got as a result of that. But just because science and technology moves forward, sometimes people say it goes too quickly and we don't have like the ethics to keep up with it. And part of the principle of the proposals is that, you know, we're not keeping up with modern day life. It's like, well, just because we can genetically engineer humans doesn't mean we should. Like, is anyone monitoring what those twins in China are, like how they are? I mean, they're anonymous. They're, you know, it's like this mysterious, we don't know. And the doctor who's come out of prison, he did an interview recently and he said something like, you know, he went too quickly. And you think, well, yeah, you kind of did, you know, and you broke international ethics code. So, I mean, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. And I would apply that to surrogacy. Just because you can, with the law, with the science, with everything, it doesn't mean you should. And if we are going to allow it, if this is something that we want to regulate and tighten up or relax or liberalize, whatever it is, it's okay to ask questions, and it's sort of a matter of society to decide, because it's shifting a line that we all have to kind of sign up for. And if we move that line forward and say, oh, we're okay doing this, then there are consequences to that. And then, like, how much further does that line shift, you know, just through kind of like scope creep, or does it stay in one place? And, you know, I for one would like to ask questions of the people who are going to be deciding this law, if indeed it progresses.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I go back to, there's the, you know, the should or the oughts and the ethics, and those are informed by stories. But there's also the hard data. And if the outcomes need to be documented somehow, and if they're not being documented, that is a huge, just a medical ethical quandary. I don't know why they are not studying.
I mean, I think we know a lot from two related subjects, which you've mentioned, so donor conceived children and adoption. I think we know a lot that can inform our policy around surrogacy if we regulate it. But yeah, I mean, if you are conducting a study where you have, I don't know, 10 babies, 20 babies, whatever. And so you say you have 20 babies and 10 of them are born through surrogacy and the other 10 are not. But all of them are taken from their mothers at birth, because the 10 for surrogacy are, and the 10 that aren't through surrogacy or for commissioning parents are, you know, are taken from their mothers. What we know so much about child development already, and you know, the mother baby bond, like that wouldn't pass ethics, that wouldn't pass an ethics committee. So why do we do it then? I mean, that's just a good enough, that's a good question, right? So we wouldn't do it in other circumstances, and in adoption we only do it because we want to keep the child safe and alive and healthy. So why is that different with surrogacy? Why are we saying it's state-sanctioned parenthood, so it should be closer in its regulation to adoption than it is to natural conception, because we don't regulate natural conception. People just have babies. some of those people shouldn't have babies, and those people who shouldn't have babies probably end up being monitored by social services. So that we already have systems in place to sort of monitor the naturally conceived children that arrive in this world in, developed, systems where we have social workers and we have health and social care. So, we just try and center children in those circumstances. So I don't know why it's different.
So how can people learn more about your work and about these issues? Where can they go?
They can go to Twitter and find us it's at Wombs Not For Rent. And then our website is stopsurrogacynouk.org. You can email us there. You can find out about if you actually do a hashtag of just surrogacy on Twitter, that you'll get all kinds of things. But, the stuff that we share, you'll find on our timeline or through that hashtag. And we really do invite people to contact us, and particularly women who have surrogacy regret, because their stories are generally not shared. There's a lot of shame. There's a lot of like, oh, I just want to move on. I don't want to think about it anymore. So we do encourage that. And from Nordic Model Now, there's a template for UK residents to send a message to their MPs about this currently. So we collaborated with them on that, and that's on their website. So that's Nordic Model Now. So yeah, we just encourage people to sort of think about it, and let us know if you've got any questions or want to find out more.
Yeah. I'll link all that in the description, Lexi. Thank you for entering into this conversation for me. It's kind of, it might be slanderous to say it's very fascinating, but it is very fascinating because it brings up so many questions. And it's also a really important issue because it is about the foundations of what we are as human beings, and how the relationship between us and our technology and ethics. And having that conversation and bringing light to the stories that aren't being told is in and of itself an ethical act. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity, and yeah, for the interest in the topic. It's my favorite subject, so I'll talk to anybody about it. If anyone wants to talk to me, you're welcome to contact me.
Excellent. So